I'll try and take as little time as possible with this. Our first speaker is Professor Thavolia Glymph, Professor of History and Law at Duke University, and I shall now hand it to her.
Good morning. As has everyone before me, I just want to say what a great honor it is to be here in Vernon, and Georgette and family and Peter, thank you for not only inviting us, but putting up with myriad questions and problems along the way. So, the title of my talk is a little confusing. Freedom's Price Revisited, and I want to talk about why it's confusing. Transactional data in the business of making American freedom. Freedom had a price. That statement would have come as no surprise to any American in 1861, nor in 1865 at the conclusion of a war fought to determine who had the right to freedom and at what price. In recent years, a lot of historians have been talking about prices. They've been pivoting again to the question of freedom's price with regard to emancipation. They ask whether or not African Americans paid too heavy a price. Some say they did. They ask whether or not African Americans, the price they paid, overwhelmed the freedoms that they won, such that freedom became essentially nothing or useless. I'm not in that camp. Freedom, people throughout time have been willing to pay a steep price for freedom, and African Americans were no different. They knew long before the war started, every time they ran away, every time they talked back, every time they broke a shovel, they knew what the price was for freedom, and this did not hold them back. In this very brief talk, I want to refocus our attention on the question from the perspective of the newly freed and in the language of transaction data. Only because I've got two mics going here, only because it has been useful to me as I try to work through questions about what freedom meant. I am not, I should say, totally confident at this point that this kind of analytic works, or how well it works, whether or not it will remain a part of my work, and I leave that up to you to help me figure out today. Transaction data describes an event, the result of a transaction. Transaction data has always had a time dimension, a numerical value, and refers to one or more objects. Typically, transactions include things like financial orders, invoices, and payments. And what I want, or have been trying to think about in particular, are invoices. Invoices and payments for freedom. And finally, I want to say just a little bit about how these invoices were submitted by Black and white Southern Unionists in ways that I think speak to the legacy of slavery and the legacy and the war in the South, and thinking about race. One invoice was submitted by Samuel Harrington. He took an invoice to a Freedmen's Bureau agent. It was May of 1865. The invoice was for his wife. He told the agent that his wife was being held, quote, as a slave by a local white doctor who refuses to let her go. A month later, the local police went to Harrington's home and arrested his wife for idleness. They seemed partially satisfied when she said, okay, if you don't take me, I'll go home. That is not her home with her husband, but the home from which she had run away. That is her former mistress's home. That's where they wanted her, and that's the home they wanted her to consider her home. They called her the so-called wife of Samuel. Former slaves by the thousands submitted such invoices, claiming the right to own themselves. William Johnson carried an invoice to the Bureau seeking financial compensation. His crop had been taken from him from on his property by a gang of white men. This gang of white men had been sent to his property by a white woman, Elizabeth McCaskill. She told them to waylay him. She told them to attack him in his own field. She told them to shoot him, and they did. He said when he took his invoice to the Freedmen's Bureau, they attacked him because he was a free man and because he was a unionist, because he had stood up for the union, and that was the price he paid for freedom. White people also carried invoices to federal agents claims to Black people, claims that they refused to believe had been extinguished by emancipation. One group of white people complained that they had lost the right to legally whip and brand Black people, and they asked for relief, particularly against Black men who carried deadly weapons. Union and Republicans had their own ideas about the price of freedom and who should and should not bear it. This too was part of Lincoln's unfinished work that the Republican Party would carry forward. And one of the places we see this is not only in the invoices that Black people carry to courts and to Freedmen's Bureau agents, we also see it in the courting by Republicans of Southern white unionists. And here I do not mean those famously in the border states of Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri. Rather, I'm talking about those white unionists that Lincoln would have been most fond of, who found themselves the attention of groups like the American Union Commission. These were white refugees, and these are the refugees in the title of the Bureau's, the formal title of the Freedmen's Bureau. I imagine that Lincoln would have considered them a very important part of his unfinished business. The Union Commission was very particular and specific about who they were working for. The commission, or the word commission, they stated, was a word they used because it was approved by Lincoln and the War Department. Union, because caring for those who had remained faithful was important, those who had worked to save the country, and they were all white. These were the tens of thousands of white refugees who took the side of the Union. An American, because its object was national, not local. The commission believed that Southern white unionists had paid too dearly for freedom for Black people. They had been forced to abandon their homes. They had been plundered by guerrillas and armies from both sides. They had faced forced depopulation in places like Atlanta. Union armies had turned thousands of white people homeless, and according to the commission, they had become naked creatures out of doors, and most of them were women and children. These were women and children whose husbands and fathers had joined the Union Army or were fighting for the U.S. cause, or who had been forced against their will into the ranks of the rebel army. These women and children, according to the commission, quote, had the right to every claim upon our charity and every sacred title to our gratitude. Even though white refugees, even those who were the families of our enemies, were still women and children at our mercy. And those of you who know, just a tad bit about my work, you know that that was not the attitude towards Black women and children refugees. As many Lincoln scholars have noted, Lincoln sincerely believed that slavery was wrong. He did not believe that Black people could be, if emancipated, made equal politically or economically. Lincoln, as Eric Foner has been quoted as saying, is thinking through his own position of slavery, that slavery ought to be abolished, but he doesn't really know how. He's not an abolitionist, and at this point, he doesn't really see Black people as an intrinsic part of American society. They're kind of alien, an alien group that's been uprooted and now need to go back to Africa. But Black people were to remain, and the question remained what to do with them. The task of figuring out what this meant would be placed in the hands of a growing bureaucracy of Northerners who would claim various titles as provost marshals, as superintendents of freed men, as treasury agents, as commissioners of subsistence, as doctors and surgeons, and into their hands fell a great deal of power, the power to set the price for freedom, to set it by age, level of disability, and gender. In 1862, the US Congress appropriated $50,000 to help Black people who had run from slavery to provide medicine and medical care. $50,000 was not anywhere near enough. This was out of a total budget of $729 million. There were some who thought it was enough. There were many Northerners who saw or believed at least that Black people would see this as a huge gesture on the part of the federal government, that they would see it as the federal government, saying to them, you are a part of us, you are one of us. Even when this task of taking care of Black people was formulated in the form of a burden. So on the one hand, you have Congress appropriating a budget, money in a budget to help Black people, and on the other hand, while they are like really helping white refugees, they are asking Black people who are refugees to help themselves. And they're saying that even if we force you to help yourself and do this by taxing your labor, that's the price of freedom. And in that recognition, they said Black people would see themselves as Americans, as citizens, and so forth. That they would see the government taxing them as demonstrable proof of their commitment of Black people's commitment to bearing this burden. So African Americans paid the price in all kinds of ways. They paid it in taxes. And they paid it in the profits that the government took from the cotton they produced. They paid it by the millions of dollars, money that went to pay for hospitals, for hospital stewards, for medical assistants, for tools and buildings and clothing and utensils. Money that would also go, when the war ended, to fund Howard University and Fisk and Florida Institute and St. Augustine's Normal College and Collegiate Institute. The money that Black women made during the war would go to furniture, help pay for Marysville College and Atlanta U and Storer College and East Tennessee Wesleyan College and Richmond Educational Association and St. Martin's School for Loyal Refugees and Freed Men. Black women's labor would help pay for the National Theological Institute. The price paid was also tallied in orphans and rapes and abortions and evictions from camps. But even when Black people submitted their own invoices and the claims for payment, they always said this invoice should include citizenship rights. In the camps, which I've spent too long now working on, Black people submitted invoices to and claimed the right to freedom and citizenship. And they were very direct about the claim to citizenship. But even here, the level of violence defied their efforts to submit these kinds of claims often, but it did not stop them from submitting these kinds of claims. These were the kinds of claims that women like Margaret Ferguson submitted. Hers was an interesting claim. She claimed the right to freedom and citizenship. And long before we began talking about Black women claiming and pointing out and identifying men who raped them after the war, she was one of the women who came forward and said, I was raped. And because I was raped, I want an abortion. There were other women like her who came in and claimed their freedom and citizenship on the basis of the injuries that their bodies demonstrated. Women who came in and said, I claim my freedom because here, look at my leg. Look at my foot. My leg is gangrened from just below the knee to my toe. My tibia is exposed and destroyed. And I cannot bear an operation. But my wounds look just like the wounds of a soldier because I have been a soldier in one sense. These kinds of claims have sort of evaded the eyes and attention of historians. And I wonder why. At what price do we continue to evade or ignore these claims and the price Black people paid for freedom? Thank you.
Next speaker is Steve Hahn, professor of history at New York University.
Thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here. I'm only sorry that my teaching responsibilities didn't allow me to arrive before yesterday. By all accounts, it's been a really wonderful conference. I think of it not simply as a conference about Lincoln's unfinished work, but a conference about Vernon's work. I really can't think of anybody who better embodies what's important about studying history and being a historian than Vernon Burton. History as a way of thinking, history as a way of learning, history as a way of acting, and history, to evoke someone earlier, as a way of creating a community. I first met Vernon, I'm sure he doesn't remember this. I was a grad student at the Newberry Library, and Vernon had just finished his dissertation on Edgefield County, and Vernon was sort of this god because he had done this quantitative work that nobody else could even imagine doing. We were just thinking about, how to learn how to run some data, and he had kind of done everybody. And I think it's sort of an example of the ways in which Vernon has always really been a pioneer in how to make contact with the past, but also to speak very powerfully to the present. So I thank you, Vernon, and I'm all the more honored to have been invited here. Yay, Vernon! I'm kind of dialing back a little chronologically to think not so much about Lincoln's unfinished business, but to some extent about the legacy of some of Lincoln's early insights. In 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville published the first of his two-volume Democracy in America, based on nearly a year of travel in the United States during the early 1830s. And needless to say, it has come to be regarded as one of the seminal texts in American political and cultural history, and to this day is central in framing popular and academic understandings of American political culture and what we oftentimes talk about as American political distinctiveness. Tocqueville in Democracy in America remarked on the quote-unquote equality of conditions he found across the land, on the robust democratic practices he observed, especially at the local and at the associational levels, on the fluidity of social life, and on the strength of Republican institutions despite the scale of the Republic itself. Indeed, in many ways, Tocqueville's work would serve to validate what has often been represented as Lincoln's America and the Lincoln ideal, a society organized around the energies of small producers, of artisans, farmers, and small manufacturers, a society organized by the prospects of economic independence and social mobility, and by a political democracy based on near universal suffrage, at least by 19th century standards. It was a society that informed ideas of American exceptionalism, and one that thousands of men would fight at great cost to preserve under the leadership of Lincoln himself. But Lincoln seems to have had a very different view of the United States at the time. In January 1838, just 3 years after Democracy in America appeared, a 28-year-old Abraham Lincoln spoke before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, on the topic of the perpetuation of our political institutions. After expressing his gratitude to our fathers for the political gifts they handed down, Lincoln argued that the danger the country and its institutions faced, and he thought they were serious, did not come from abroad. They did not come from foreign powers and armies, but rather they must spring up amongst us. There is, Lincoln continued, something of an ill omen among us. And what he meant was, and I quote, the increasing disregard for the law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgments of the courts, and the worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice. The disposition, he continued, is awfully fearful in any community, and that it now exists in ours, though grating to our feelings to admit, it would be a violation of the truth and an insult to our intelligence to deny. Accounts of outrages, he said, committed by mobs form the everyday news of our times. They have pervaded the country from New England to Louisiana. They are neither peculiar to the eternal snows of the former, nor to the burning suns of the latter. Neither are they confined to the slaveholding or to the non-slaveholding states. Alike, he said, they spring up among the pleasure-hunting masters of Southern slaves and the order-loving citizens of steady habits. Sounds familiar, unfortunately. These passions, Lincoln feared, could lay the path for tyranny unless a new, as he put it, political religion based on reverence for the laws and cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason took hold. Now, Lincoln in 1838, a very famous address of his, was reflecting on the mob murders only months earlier of Francis McIntosh, a free man of color in St. Louis, and Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist editor in Alton, Illinois, as well as on a number of grisly lynchings of whites as well as blacks in Mississippi some years before. But he wasn't doing this for effect. He certainly captured the tenor of social and political life in much of America in the 1830s. But the country did seem to pulse with vigilante violence and the rough justice that aggrieved communities could mete out. The incidence of what would be called or could be called riots and mobs spiked during the decades of the 1830s, especially in the years between 1834 and 1837, and they exploded in rural as well as urban areas, small towns as well as large cities, and as Lincoln suggested, the Northeast, the Middle Atlantic, and the Midwest, as well as the Southeast and the Southwest. Anti-abolitionist and anti-black mobs are perhaps best known and best studied, but these were hardly alone. Riots erupted to defend fugitive slaves, to punish gamblers and counterfeiters, to torment Catholics and Catholic institutions, churches and convents, and to drive off those who were regarded as religious threats and nonconformists, such as the Mormons, who were run out of Missouri shortly after Lincoln made this address in Illinois, and then they relocated to the Illinois town of Nauvoo, not far from Springfield, where Joseph Smith, their founder and leader, would soon be murdered. Although the democratization of the suffrage and the advent of mass political parties during what we call the Jacksonian era would seem to have tamed political conflicts and provided some stable outlets for their expression, political practices of the 1830s, indeed of the entire 19th century, were suffused by paramilitarism, organized harassment, and outright coercion, even if they were chiefly involved with the fate of these new mass political parties. When, for example, voters made their way to the polls on election day, they were ordinarily greeted with a scene that was not for the weak or faint-hearted. Representatives of competing candidates and parties jostled with one another, shouting insults and epithets, lubricated by the alcohol that was always available, as they tried to round up their supporters and strike fear into the opposition. Each one, an observer of a municipal election in St. Louis, remarked in 1838, each one talking loud and fast, bringing forward the voters, telling them who to vote for, and challenging the votes of everyone with who they had the faintest shadow of a chance, handing out tickets, crossing out names, some imitating the barking of dogs, some the roaring of bulls, all making as much noise as they could. Scuffling and fighting often broke out, with local toughs in attendance to enforce political discipline, while employers, merchants, and master craftsmen might watch as their employees and clerks deposited their ballots or announced their choices where viva voce voting still prevailed, as it did in a number of places. The weeks preceding an election were usually given over to raucous processions and parades, replete with torches, banners, fifes, and drums, and to militia musters meant to demonstrate the martial basis of political citizenship and the legions of followers that contestants could command. Not infrequently, the political faithful took the opportunity to inflict physical punishment on their enemies, especially if ethnic or religious antagonisms were added to the mix, as they often were. The violence that spilled onto the floors of Congress, as Joanne Freeman has recently shown, not to mention the floors of state legislatures and municipal councils, followed logically from these battles on the ground. But there was much more. The wider and less formal and institutional politics of the 1830s were centered around violence and coercion. We are perhaps most familiar with the process of Indian removal that came with great cost to native peoples of the Southeast. But this was the decade as well of the Black Hawk War, where Lincoln served in the Illinois militia, although he didn't see action, and the Second Seminole War in Florida, which would stand as the longest war in American history until Vietnam. Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, came early in the decade and gave important shape to the politics of Virginia and the entire Southeast. And it was followed by a slave conspiracy in Mississippi in the mid-1830s that saw some of the vigilante and racial violence that Lincoln would soon condemn, with nooses hanging like Spanish moss. Farther west, American slaveholders in the province of Texas launched a rebellion against the Mexican state, one of an assortment of separatist movements that erupted across the continent that put the issue of annexation and the geographical expansion of slavery on the federal political plate with worrisome consequences. The political economy of the United States in this period suggests, too, that the Lincoln ideal was more a political construction than a reflection of social reality. We have, of course, been recently reminded, though I might add it, this has long been recognized, that slave-based cotton production and export were important sources of the country's economic growth. And we've also come to recognize that no neat dividing line separated the worlds of slavery and freedom that anti- and pro-slavery discourses, including Lincoln's, would attempt to draw. The fugitive slave law, slave hiring, long-term indentures, and generous court rulings combined to give slavery a legal basis in much of the North, and particularly in the Middle Atlantic and Midwest, including Illinois, through the 1830s. But the pulse of economic change was quickening more generally. We needn't embrace the idea of a market revolution. After all, the dominant actors in American economic life in the 1830s were still the merchants and large landholders who had been on top roughly since the time of European settlement. We need not embrace the idea of a market revolution to see that. The artisan shops and family farms of the revolutionary and early national eras were being disrupted and reorganized in many places. The changes were most in evidence along the eastern seaboard and the new transportation routes like the Erie Canal, but they could already be seen farther inland as well. Many urban and small-town trades witnessed an expanding division of labor and growing involvement in regional and generally super-local exchange as master craftsmen increasingly took up the role in merchandising, while production was left in the hands of journeymen and apprentices, with subcontracting and outwork also on the rise. For their part, agricultural households were increasing the share of market crops they raised and were intensifying the exploitation of household labor as they came to depend more and more on store-bought goods. Almost everywhere, economic inequality became more pronounced, and even in rural counties of the Northeast and Midwest, they became more socially stratified. The top tenth of landholders increased their share of total wealth, while farm labor and farm tenancy grew notably, both results of rising land values. And this was especially to be seen during the 1830s and 1840s into the 1850s across the prairies of central Illinois, where Lincoln's Springfield sat. I can give a shout out to Don Doyle, whose early work, before he became the great global historian, was actually a social history of a town near Springfield in Illinois that is very helpful as far as all this goes. Whether Lincoln's Lyceum address was meant to herald his emergence as an American political figure of significance, it surely captures the deep divisions, the widespread violence, and the potential weakness of Republican institutions that afflicted American society in the 1830s. Although he suggested that slavery and slaveholding were special contributors to the crisis, Lincoln was also clear in arguing that the crisis knew no sectional boundaries and was to be found both where slavery had been abolished as well as where it thrived. Indeed, Lincoln worried about the men, quote, of ambition and talent who might arise and whose ruling passions would not be satisfied by building upon any edifice erected by others, the founders, that a Caesar or an Alexander or a Napoleon would at some time spring up among us, seeking, as he said, distinction, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving freemen. We can surely appreciate, given Lincoln's warnings about mob rule and the tyranny it could produce, why he held abolitionism at arm's length, given the provocations it raised and the potential disorder it could unleash. and why he came to an anti-slavery that insisted on fealty to the Constitution and to the laws designed, in his view, to maintain the Republic. We might also better understand not only the importance of the Trans-Mississippi West to Lincoln and other anti-slavery supporters, but also how Lincoln could embrace and develop a construction of the American body politic that both emphasized a neatly divided House, together with the threat that a House united under slaveholders would pose, which is to suggest that the anti-slavery nationalism of Lincoln and others took form not simply in relation to an expanding slave power of the South, but also in relation to the social and political violence and the centrifugal forces eating and pulling at the vitals of the American Republic most everywhere. So what do we make of Alexis de Tocqueville and his classic panegyric to American democracy and republicanism? How do we square Tocqueville's apparent adulations with Lincoln's stern warnings? Now, some would use the Lyceum Address to look less at what was happening around Lincoln and what it meant for the country in political terms, and more at what the address signified for Lincoln's own intellectual development and for his political ambitions. That does indeed appear to be the thrust of historical interpretations, making bows to the tumultuousness of the 1830s while accepting the Tocquevillian representations of American political culture more generally. Some would note that Tocqueville toured the country in the early 1830s, a few years before the widespread eruption of the sort of mob violence that Lincoln decried, so that the publication of Democracy in America proved somewhat out of sync with new circumstances on the ground. Yet, just in conclusion, we may also take the juxtaposition of Tocqueville and Lincoln more seriously and use it as an opportunity to look more closely at what Tocqueville himself had to say. Impressed as he was with the American Democratic Republic, he, like Lincoln, also worried that Americans of the 1830s might no longer heed the cautions and warnings of the founders. And while he was highly critical of European monarchy and absolutism, Tocqueville also saw the dangerous underbelly of the liberal and democratic practices he wrote of. Indeed, where Lincoln feared the emergence of a tyrant in the form of a Napoleon or a Caesar, Tocqueville saw the threat of tyranny in what he called the omnipotence of the majority, which encased thought and spirit and could, as he said, drive minorities to desperation. There are many layers to democracy in America involving law, public opinion, legislative institutions, the nature of authority, and race, which defy some of the neat packages into which it is sometimes placed. But like Lincoln himself, Tocqueville was also a keen critic of the American political tradition that he has identified with marking. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to thank all of you for really stimulating presentations, but I'd like to ask some questions and of Steve to comment a little bit more on how today we start looking back in the past and finding some usable things. So looking at the way in which women in the wake of freedom sought healthcare, linking that seems good, and the way in which Steve is making us remember that the mob and the majority is something that maybe Lincoln, in a prescient way, warned us about. And Thavolia, sorry, I'm just always interested in your language today about invoices and prices. I'm trying to think of all the influences that it might have come to that. The bill of lading that Hofstadter reminds us of, or perhaps the new sort of flavor of trying to bring capitalism and the prices of slavery together. So I'm just wondering how that influenced your thinking, and/or reparations, if you could comment more on that.
You know, I've been struggling a lot with what it means to be a historian in this world of fake news, and which challenges, you know, so much of what we do, why it is important for us to insist on the historical method as a way of finding out. You know, I'm kind of in the middle of writing a book on what I'm calling the illiberal tradition or traditions in American history. And I mean, it's not exactly designed to lift one's spirits, but it certainly does suggest that I think so much of what we're looking at in the commentary of what's going on in the country sees it as a product that's of recent vintage and not engaging with the very, very deep history of illiberal tendencies and also their close connection with what we regard as liberal traditions and how that tradition itself was invented, you know, at a certain point. But I do think, as I think the discussion here suggests too, that in time of crisis, history really offers us a way of thinking about alternative possibilities that have to do with excavating or reminding ourselves about struggles in the past, what people were willing and able to push back against, what new ideas they put on the table that we've forgotten about, and that even if we can't use them in the same way, can inform how we think about moving forward. So, you know, I think in general, at times of political crisis, history is an incredibly valuable resource.
So Catherine, trying to remember the question. So language, I mean, I'm not really trying to respond or be a part of in any direct way the current capitalism and slavery debate or debacle, I don't know which. You know, I'm trained as in political economy and social history, Harold Whitman and Darlene, and so both those kinds of methodologies in thinking influence how I think, and I think I'm also just trying to, in terms of language, reflect where I stand and where, I mean, not as a historian, and I'm sure that in the back of my mind is always trying to think about not what I think may have happened, but what people at the time probably saw and thought based on, you know, what's in the archive. And so I enter the archive as a place where I may pick up something that I don't understand. And so my language is often couched not in, well, maybe, but rather couched in, like, I'm not sure yet what this means. And so I'm still trying to figure it out. And so the downside is that, well, I'm not going to say. Anyway, that's kind of the best I can offer.